June 2, 1942. The waters northwest of Midway Atoll. Lieutenant Commander John Murphy stands on the bridge of USS Tambor, scanning the horizon through salt-crusted binoculars. His submarine has been submerged for 16 hours, batteries nearly dead, air thick enough to taste. Standard doctrine says, stay down, stay safe. But Murphy has a problem that no amount of training prepared him for. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. He cannot see. Below the surface, his periscope offers a narrow slit of visibility, 3 degrees of arc in an ocean stretching 360 degrees around him. The Japanese fleet is out there somewhere. Intelligence promised a massive carrier force approaching Midway. 4 days of patrol have yielded nothing but empty water and the creeping certainty that American submarines are hunting blind in the most important naval battle of the Pacific War. What Murphy doesn't know yet, what Pearl Harbor will take months to admit, is that the entire American submarine doctrine is built on a lie. Submerged approaches work beautifully in peacetime exercises against cooperative targets moving in straight lines. Against an enemy fleet zigzagging at 20 knots with destroyer screens probing every shadow, submerged submarines are virtually useless. Success rate, less than 2%. But in the chaos of Midway, a handful of submarine commanders will discover something that contradicts every principle drilled into them at New London. Surface running, exposing their boats to enemy fire, hunting like destroyers instead of submarines, will sink more Japanese tonnage in 4 days than the previous 6 months of submerged warfare combined. The question isn't whether doctrine can survive contact with reality. The question is how many targets American submariners will miss before someone has the courage to fight the wrong way. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Lieutenant Commander John Murphy had followed the book perfectly. USS Tambor had departed Pearl Harbor on May 24th, carrying 24 Mark 14 torpedoes, 70 days of provisions, and orders that were brutally specific. Proceed to patrol station northwest of Midway. Intercept and destroy Japanese carrier forces approaching from the northwest. Standard submerged attack procedures apply. The orders reflected doctrine that had been refined over 2 decades of peacetime exercises and submarine school lectures. Submerged submarines were invisible, invulnerable. Surface ships couldn't detect them, couldn't track them, couldn't kill them. The submarine's greatest weapon wasn't its torpedoes. It was its ability to hide beneath the waves while stalking targets that had no idea death was approaching. Murphy believed this completely. Every officer in the submarine force believed it. The doctrine had been proven in countless exercises where submarines successfully infiltrated, defended anchorages, achieved perfect firing positions, and theoretically destroyed entire battle fleets. The fact that these exercises used friendly targets, moving predictably while lookouts pretended not to see approaching periscopes, seemed like minor details that wouldn't matter in actual combat. May 28th brought the first hint that something was wrong. Tambor's sonar detected distant propeller sounds, possibly Japanese scouts probing ahead of the main fleet. Murphy ordered his boat to periscope depth, carefully raising the scope for a 3-second look that doctrine promised would be undetectable to enemy observers. The ocean was empty, no ships visible in any direction. The sonar contact had been a ghost, perhaps a thermal layer creating false echoes, perhaps wishful thinking by an operator who'd been listening to ocean noise for 18 hours straight. Murphy lowered the periscope and settled back to wait, conserving battery power for the moment when real targets appeared. That moment never came. Submerged, Tambor could see roughly 6 miles on a clear day if Murphy risked extending the periscope to its maximum height. But the periscope created a visible wake that enemy lookouts could spot from 3 miles away, forcing submarine commanders to use brief, low-power looks that reduced visibility to perhaps 3 miles. In an ocean where Japanese forces might be spread across a 100-mile front, Tambor was essentially blind. The geometry was brutal and undeniable. A submerged submarine moved at perhaps 3 knots to conserve battery power. A Japanese carrier task force moved at 20 knots. If the enemy fleet passed even 10 miles north or south of Tambor's position, Murphy would never detect them. His periscope would scan empty water, while the targets he was supposed to intercept steamed past beyond his limited horizon. Below in the control room, Chief of the boat Raymond Mitchell checked the battery charge indicators with the practiced pessimism of a veteran submariner who understood the tyranny of electrical power. 16 hours submerged had drained the batteries to 40% capacity. Tambor could remain underwater perhaps another 24 hours before the air became unbreathable and the batteries died completely. "Chief," Murphy called down through the conning tower hatch. "How long until we need to surface for a charge?" "Depends on how much longer you want to breathe, sir," Mitchell replied. His tone carried no insubordination, just the flat realism of stating physical facts. "Air's getting thick. Figure 8 more hours before the carbon dioxide scrubbers are saturated. Then we surface whether we want to or not." Murphy understood the calculation. Every submarine commander faced it. Stay submerged and maintain the invisibility that doctrine promised would keep them safe, or surface to recharge batteries and refresh air, accepting the risk of being spotted by enemy aircraft or surface vessels that could destroy a submarine caught on the surface with a single salvo. The doctrine said stay down. The doctrine said safety lay in remaining submerged. The doctrine had been written by men who'd never hunted a zigzagging enemy fleet in the open ocean. June 3rd brought multiple sonar contacts that suggested the Japanese fleet was finally approaching. Murphy ordered Tambor to periscope depth repeatedly, burning precious battery power to maneuver for glimpses of targets that always seemed to be just beyond his limited visibility. Each periscope look revealed the same frustrating emptiness. Sky, water, nothing. The radio crackled with fragmentary reports from other American submarines on patrol. USS Cuttlefish had detected enemy ships to the west, but lost contact while maneuvering for an attack approach. USS Nautilus reported sighting what might be carriers, but couldn't close to torpedo range before the targets disappeared beyond the horizon. USS Grouper had fired 4 torpedoes at a battleship from maximum range, all misses, and was now being depth-charged by destroyers that had appeared seemingly from nowhere. Each report followed the same pattern: brief sightings, lost contacts, unsuccessful attacks. The American submarine force was supposed to decimate the Japanese fleet before it reached Midway. Instead, they were fumbling blind while the enemy steamed past their patrol stations untouched. Lieutenant Richard Kane, Tambor's executive officer, stood beside Murphy in the cramped conning tower as they reviewed their position on the navigation chart. Red pencil marks indicated where intelligence predicted the Japanese fleet would pass. Blue marks showed Tambor's actual patrol track. The two barely intersected. "We're in the wrong place," Kane said quietly. "Not an accusation, just a statement of tactical reality. Even if the fleet passes exactly where Pearl says they will, we'll be lucky to get a single periscope glimpse before they're gone." Murphy knew Kane was right, but doctrine offered no alternative. Submerged submarines couldn't chase targets across open ocean. They couldn't maneuver at high speed without draining their batteries in hours. They could only wait in assigned patrol positions and hope that enemy ships happened to pass within their narrow cone of visibility. The doctrine assumed perfect intelligence about enemy movements. The doctrine assumed targets would cooperate by steaming directly toward waiting submarines. The doctrine assumed that 3 knots underwater and 3-mile visibility would somehow be sufficient to intercept fleets moving at 20 knots across 100-mile fronts. Reality was proving those assumptions catastrophically wrong. June 4th began with the sound of distant explosions rumbling through Tambor's hull like underwater thunder. The Battle of Midway had begun somewhere beyond the horizon. American carrier aircraft were attacking the Japanese fleet. Bombs were falling, ships were burning, and USS Tambor was 30 miles away, blind and helpless, listening to a battle they couldn't see and couldn't join. "Surface," Murphy ordered. The decision came without conscious thought, driven by pure frustration at hours of futile submerged searching. Doctrine said, stay down. Doctrine said submarines were vulnerable on the surface, but doctrine wasn't sinking any Japanese ships, and Murphy was done following rules written by men who'd never fought a real battle. Tambor broke surface at 0830 hours, her diesel engines roaring to life as compressed air blew water from her ballast tanks. The bridge watch scrambled topside, binoculars scanning a horizon that suddenly extended 15 miles in every direction instead of 3. And there, bearing 270 degrees, smoke columns rising into the morning sky. The Japanese fleet, visible at precipices, last. Chief Mitchell appeared at Murphy's shoulder, his expression carefully neutral. "Captain, we're exposed up here. Any aircraft could spot us from 20 miles out." "Let them spot us," Murphy replied. "At least we can see what we're supposed to be shooting at." What Murphy couldn't know was that 5 other American submarine commanders were making the same illegal decision at almost the same moment. USS Nautilus, Growler, Grayling, Grenadier, and Trout were all surfacing, abandoning the invisibility that doctrine promised would keep them safe, choosing visibility and speed over the illusory protection of hiding beneath waves that prevented them from finding any targets at all. The doctrine said submarines were hunters, but submerged submarines at Midway were proving to be something else entirely, blind sentries guarding empty ocean while the real battle raged beyond their limited horizons. Tambor's lookout spotted the first target at 0915 hours, a Japanese heavy cruiser, possibly Mogami class, steaming east at high speed with 2 destroyers flanking her. The range was 12 miles, far beyond any periscope sighting but clearly visible from Tambor's bridge in the morning light. Murphy made the calculation instantly. Submerged approach would require 3 hours to reach firing position, by which time the target would be long gone. Surface pursuit at Tambor's maximum speed of 20 knots might allow an intercept in 90 minutes if the cruiser maintained course and speed. Every instinct trained into him at submarine school screamed that this was suicide. Surface submarines were vulnerable targets. Destroyers could blow them out of the water with their deck guns. Aircraft could bomb them helpless. The doctrine existed for good reasons, written in the blood of submarines that had surfaced at the wrong moment and died instantly under enemy fire. But Murphy had spent 3 days following doctrine and achieved exactly nothing. 0 targets engaged, 0 torpedoes fired, 0 contribution to the battle that would determine control of the Pacific. He ordered maximum speed, keeping Tambor on the surface as her diesels pushed the boat to 20 knots in pursuit of prey that doctrine said she should never chase this way. The risk was enormous and undeniable. Tambor's grey paint offered little camouflage against the blue Pacific. Her silhouette was visible from any aircraft or ship with functioning lookouts. She was betting everything on speed and visibility, abandoning the protection of invisibility for the chance to actually find and kill an enemy warship. Lieutenant Kane stood beside the target-bearing transmitter, feeding data to the torpedo data computer below. "Range closing, Captain. 11 miles now. Target maintaining course. We'll be in firing position in 70 minutes if she doesn't alter speed." 70 minutes on the surface. 70 minutes exposed to enemy aircraft that had to be searching these waters. Every submarine commander's nightmare scenario, but the alternative was diving and losing contact again, returning to the blind searching that had defined 3 days of futile patrolling. The doctrine hadn't prepared them for this choice. The doctrine assumed submarines would find targets through patient submerged searching, achieve perfect firing solutions from invisible positions, and escape undetected after successful attacks. The doctrine assumed enemies would cooperate by steaming directly toward waiting submarines at predictable speeds on steady courses. Reality at Midway was teaching a different lesson. The Japanese fleet was dispersed across 100 miles of ocean, maneuvering unpredictably, and moving too fast for submerged submarines to intercept. Surface running was the only way to find them, track them, and get close enough for torpedo shots. At 10:30 hours, Murphy finally had what submarine commanders dream about: perfect firing position, clear shot at a heavy cruiser broadside. At 4,000 yards, all 6 bow tubes loaded with Mark 14 torpedoes. Everything by the book except for the one detail that violated every principle of submarine warfare. Tambor was still on the surface, completely visible to any observer aboard the enemy warship or its escorting destroyers. "Dive," Murphy ordered, not because doctrine demanded it, but because torpedo attacks required precise depth control that surface shots couldn't provide. Tambor slid beneath the waves, using just enough depth to stabilize her firing platform while keeping the range close enough that her torpedoes had a realistic chance of hitting. The 6 torpedoes launched at 30-second intervals, their Mark 6 exploders set for contact detonation after Admiral Lockwood's earlier battles with magnetic exploder failures. Murphy watched through the periscope as whitewakes streaked toward the cruiser's midsection, calculating the runtime at 46 knots over 4,000 yards. 4 torpedoes missed completely, passing ahead or astern of the target. One ran under the keel without exploding, victim to the depth-setting problems that plagued Mark 14s throughout 1942. The 6th struck the cruiser's starboard quarter with a massive explosion that sent a column of water 200 feet into the air. Not a kill, not even close, but it was a hit, confirmed damage to an enemy warship that might have escaped unscathed if Tambor had followed doctrine and remained submerged, searching blind while the cruiser steamed past 30 miles away beyond periscope range. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The destroyers reacted instantly, turning toward Tambor's periscope with the aggressive precision of escort vessels that had trained for exactly this scenario. Depth charges began falling before Murphy could fully retract the scope, forcing Tambor deep as concussions hammered through her hull. Chief Mitchell secured the boat for depth charging with the calm efficiency of a veteran who'd survived this nightmare before. Hatches dogged tight, non-essential systems shut down, absolute silence throughout the boat as 80 men stood frozen at their stations, while Japanese destroyers pounded the water above them with high explosives designed to crush submarine hulls through sheer pressure. 23 depth charges fell during the next 40 minutes. None close enough to cause serious damage, but each explosion was a reminder that surface running carried enormous risks. The doctrine existed for good reasons. Submarines caught on the surface died quickly under destroyer guns or aircraft bombs. Murphy had violated that doctrine and survived only because he'd dived before the destroyers reached firing range. But he'd also hit a Japanese cruiser that doctrine would never have brought within torpedo range. The strategic equation was changing even as depth charges rattled Tambor's hull. Surface running risked exposure but enabled attacks. Submerged running offered safety but guaranteed irrelevance. The choice between doctrine and effectiveness was becoming clear to every submarine commander at Midway. 200 miles northeast, USS Nautilus was making the same discovery through different circumstances. Commander William Brockman had surfaced at dawn to recharge batteries and spotted the Japanese carrier fleet through sheer luck, massive flat tops visible from 12 miles away in the morning light. Doctrine said dive immediately and begin a submerged approach. Brockman stayed on the surface. The carriers were moving at 24 knots, faster than any submerged submarine could chase. Brockman kept Nautilus surfaced, running at maximum speed, maintaining visual contact, while closing the range in a stern chase that would have been impossible underwater. 3 hours of surface pursuit brought him within torpedo range, just as American dive bombers began their attack on the Japanese carriers. Nautilus dived and fired 4 torpedoes at the carrier Kaga, already burning from bomb hits. 1 torpedo struck the carrier's bow, not enough to sink her but adding damage that would help send her to the bottom later that day. But the torpedo hit wasn't the important part. The important part was that Brockman had found the target only because he violated doctrine and stayed on the surface. USS Growler, under Commander Howard Gilmore, was achieving similar results 90 miles south of Midway. Gilmore had surfaced at first light for battery charging and spotted a Japanese destroyer through binoculars, visible from 10 miles away against the dawn sky. Instead of diving and attempting a submerged approach that might take hours and probably lose contact, Gilmore stayed up and chased the destroyer at full speed until achieving firing position. 3 torpedoes fired from 4,000 yards, one hit that blew the destroyer's stern off and left her dead in the water. The hit earned Growler a vicious depth charge attack, but Gilmore had sunk an enemy warship that Doctrine would have let escape beyond the horizon, while Growler fumbled blind beneath the surface. The pattern was repeating across the Midway battle space. Submarine commanders who followed Doctrine and remained submerged were achieving nothing. Those who violated Doctrine and hunted on the surface were finding targets, closing to firing range, and actually sinking Japanese ships. The statistics told the story with brutal clarity. American submarines at Midway fired a total of 45 torpedoes during June 3rd through June 6th. 8 hits, 5 confirmed sinks. Every successful attack began with surface running that let commanders maintain visual contact with fast-moving targets across at open ocean. Every failed attack involved submarines trying to hunt submerged, losing contact, and firing blindly at positions where targets used to be but had already passed. USS Grayling under Lieutenant Commander Elliot Olson demonstrated the tactical evolution happening in real time. Olson spent June 3rd and 4th following Doctrine, remaining submerged, achieving 0 contacts because his periscope couldn't see far enough to spot the Japanese fleet. June 5th, he surfaced at dawn and stayed up through morning light, scanning the horizon with binoculars until spotting a damaged Japanese carrier limping northwest with 2 destroyer escorts. The carrier was Hiryu, crippled by American air attacks but still afloat and heading home. Standard Doctrine would have required Olson to dive immediately and begin a cautious submerged approach that might take 3 hours while Hiryu escaped beyond range. Instead, Olson stayed surfaced and chased at maximum speed, closing from 15 miles to 5 miles in 90 minutes of high-speed pursuit that would have been impossible underwater. The final approach required diving to achieve proper torpedo depth control, but Olson had maintained visual contact throughout the chase, knew exactly where his target was, and fired 6 torpedoes from optimal position. 3 hits. Hiryu rolled over and sank, taking 800 crew with her and becoming the 4th Japanese carrier destroyed at Midway. The kill earned Olson a Navy Cross and a private reprimand from Submarine Force Command for unnecessary surface exposure. The reprimand revealed the institutional tension developing between combat results and doctrinal purity. Olson had violated every principle of safe submarine operations and sunk a Japanese carrier that would have escaped if he'd followed the rules. Back aboard Tambor, Murphy compiled his patrol report with the careful attention to detail that combat experience was teaching Pacific submariners. 3 days submerged, 0 contacts, 0 attacks, 0 results. 90 minutes surfaced, 1 contact, 1 attack, 1 hit on enemy cruiser. The math was undeniable, even if the implications terrified every doctrine committee at submarine school. Lieutenant Kane, reading over Murphy's shoulder as the report took shape, noted what wasn't being said explicitly. "You're not recommending surface doctrine in the formal report?" "Can't," Murphy replied. "Command would relieve me for suggesting tactics that got submarines killed in peacetime exercises. But the after-action statistics speak for themselves. Any commander smart enough to read between the lines will understand what we learned out here." What they'd learned was that 2 decades of peacetime submarine doctrine had been fundamentally wrong about Pacific warfare. Submerged submarines were blind, slow, and tactically irrelevant against alert enemies maneuvering at high speed. Surface running exposed submarines to destruction, but gave them the visibility and speed necessary to find and attack real targets under actual combat conditions. The doctrine had been perfect for the war submarine commanders trained to fight. Patient stalking of unaware targets in restricted waters where submarines could predict enemy movements and wait in ambush positions. That war didn't exist. The actual war involved hunting alert enemies across vast ocean expanses, where invisibility meant irrelevance and doctrine meant failure. USS Trout under Commander Frank Wesley demonstrated the final piece of the tactical puzzle evolving at Midway. Wesley had spent June 4th following doctrine, remaining submerged, achieving nothing. June 5th, he surfaced at dawn and began what he called aggressive patrolling, running on the surface until spotting targets, then diving for torpedo attacks before surfacing again to resume hunting. The approach violated every safety principle taught at submarine school. Surface submarines were supposed to dive immediately upon sighting enemy forces. Wesley was deliberately staying up, accepting detection risk in exchange for maintaining visual contact that let him track multiple targets simultaneously and choose which ones offered the best attack geometry. June 5 brought contacts on 3 separate Japanese ships, a destroyer, a cruiser, and what appeared to be a damaged battleship. Wesley stayed surfaced, tracking all 3 visually while calculating which target offered the best combination of value and attack feasibility. He chose the battleship, dove when within 6,000 yards, and fired 5 torpedoes that produced 2 hits on what post-battle analysis identified as the battleship Haruna. Not a kill, Haruna survived to fight again, but Wesley had damaged a capital ship that he never would have found if he'd followed doctrine and remained submerged. More importantly, his aggressive surface patrolling demonstrated tactical principles that would transform American submarine warfare for the remainder of the Pacific campaign. The Battle of Midway concluded on June 6 with American naval victory secured primarily by carrier aircraft that sank 4 Japanese carriers and established American naval dominance in the Central Pacific. But the submarine contribution, largely invisible in the official histories, had been significant beyond the simple tonnage numbers. 8 confirmed hits from 45 torpedoes fired represented an 18% hit rate, nearly 10 times better than the 2% success rate American submarines had achieved in earlier Pacific engagements. Every successful attack had begun with surface running that violated peacetime doctrine but enabled wartime effectiveness. The statistical vindication of surface tactics took months to fully compile because Submarine Force Command initially resisted, acknowledging that their doctrine had been wrong. Captain John Wilkes, commanding submarines in the Southwest Pacific, read the Midway Patrol reports with growing frustration at implications that contradicted everything he'd spent 30 years believing about submarine warfare. They're describing tactics that would get boats killed in peacetime exercises, Wilkes complained to his operations officer. Surface, running in daylight, chasing targets across open ocean, maintaining visual contact instead of seeking invisibility. This is everything we trained them not to do. Yes, sir, the operations officer replied carefully, but it's also everything that actually worked at Midway. The boats that followed doctrine sank nothing. The boats that violated doctrine sank 5 enemy ships. The numbers forced institutional recognition, even from commanders who resisted the tactical implications. Submarines that remained submerged throughout Midway. 0 confirmed sinks. Submarines that employed surface running for target acquisition. 5 confirmed sinks, 3 probable damage, hit rate approaching 20%. Admiral Charles Lockwood, who would later command Pacific submarine forces, compiled the statistical analysis that finally broke through institutional resistance. His report to Admiral Chester Nimitz in July 1942 laid out the evidence with prosecutorial precision. Submerged submarines at Midway achieved visual contact with enemy forces in only 12% of patrol periods. Surface-running submarines achieved contact in 78% of patrol periods. The visibility advantage alone explained most of the effectiveness difference. Submarines couldn't sink targets they couldn't find, and submerged searching was proving inadequate for Pacific warfare conditions. The secondary advantage involved pursuit speed. Submerged submarines moved at 3 knots. Japanese warships moved at 20 to 30 knots. Simple geometry meant submerged submarines couldn't chase any alert enemy unless that enemy cooperated by steaming directly toward their position. Surface submarines could match enemy speeds and maneuver for favorable attack geometry. Lockwood's report concluded with a recommendation that would reshape American submarine doctrine for the remainder of the war. Pacific submarines should employ surface running as their primary patrol mode, diving only for final attack approaches or when threatened by enemy aircraft or surface vessels. The invisibility that peacetime doctrine had prioritized should be sacrificed for the visibility and speed that combat experience was proving essential. The recommendation faced fierce resistance from submarine school instructors and doctrine committees, who'd spent decades teaching that submerged operations were the foundation of submarine effectiveness. Surface running had gotten submarines killed in World War I. It would get submarines killed in World War II. The resistance ignored one crucial factor. World War I submarines had been slow, fragile vessels with limited visibility and no radar. World War II fleet submarines were fast, tough boats with excellent surface speed, extended range optics, and increasingly sophisticated radar systems that would eventually let them hunt effectively at night. The Pacific Ocean was vast enough that submarines could risk surface exposure because enemy forces were too dispersed to provide mutual support. A submarine spotted on the surface had time to dive before enemy ships or aircraft could close to attack range. The risk was manageable. The alternative, remaining submerged and irrelevant, was not. Murphy never saw Lockwood's statistical analysis, but he didn't need formal vindication to know that surface running had made Tambor effective when doctrine had made her useless. His patrol report was classified immediately upon return to Pearl Harbor, marked secret, and filed where it wouldn't contaminate the official narrative that American submarines were following approved doctrine and achieving acceptable results. But submarine commanders talked. They compared notes in Pearl Harbor bars where officers gathered, after returning from patrol. They shared tactical lessons that official reports couldn't mention because those lessons contradicted approved doctrine. And gradually, quietly, without any formal authorization, American submarine tactics evolved from what doctrine said they should do toward what combat experience showed actually worked. By August 1942, most Pacific submarines were employing what they carefully called modified patrol procedures. Surface running during twilight hours when visibility favored submarine lookouts over enemy observers. Aggressive pursuit of contacts, even when that meant remaining surfaced into full daylight. Diving only when absolutely necessary for attack approaches or threat evasion. The modified procedures violated every principle of safe submarine operations. They also increased confirmed sinks from 2% to 20% of attacks, a tenfold improvement that reflected the difference between hunting blind and hunting with eyes open. The doctrine committees never officially approved surface running. They couldn't, because approval would require admitting that 2 decades of peacetime training had been fundamentally wrong about Pacific warfare conditions. But by late 1942, every submarine departing Pearl Harbor received informal guidance that carefully avoided contradicting official doctrine, while strongly suggesting tactics that combat veterans knew actually worked. Commander Murphy delivered his final briefing to USS Tambor's relief crew in September 1942, before rotating stateside for shore duty. The formal briefing covered maintenance procedures, equipment peculiarities, and patrol station assignments. Everything by the book, suitable for official transcription. The informal briefing happened later that night over drinks at the Officers' Club, where Murphy told his relief what the official reports couldn't acknowledge. Stay submerged if you want to follow doctrine and sink nothing. Surface at dawn, hunt with binoculars, and dive only when you've found something worth shooting at. You'll violate every safety principle they taught at New London. You'll also actually kill enemy ships, which is supposed to be the point of this whole enterprise. His relief, a young lieutenant commander named Thomas Hogan, listened carefully and asked the obvious question. What happens when someone gets killed following your advice instead of official doctrine? Murphy considered the question seriously before answering. Someone's going to get killed either way. Question is whether they die safe and useless or exposed and effective. At Midway, the safe boats achieved nothing. The exposed boats sank 5 Japanese warships. I know which approach I'd want if I were betting my life on submarine warfare. The conversation ended there, but Hogan understood the implications. American submarine doctrine was being rewritten not through formal channels, but through combat experience, shared quietly between commanders who'd learned that survival sometimes required violating the rules designed to keep them safe. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.